It's lovely to see you all this morning. So I'm the church leader here, and there are a few faces that I don't know so well, so it's good to meet you. Sometimes I start a talk with a question. The title is Purpose-Driven Marriage. I was going to ask, who in your lives has exampled marriage to you in a way that's been significant? Now, this doesn't matter whether you are married or not, whether your parents were married or they aren't anymore, or any of that. And it could be a negative or a positive example of marriage, but a significant example of marriage to you in your life. Okay. Were there any things that you heard, or it could be things that you shared, but any things that you heard that you thought, wow, that's a really profound or impressive example? You can rack your brains. I'll just keep pattering the background. If there's not, that's okay. We can move along, but I want to give space for it. The Queen. The late Queen Elizabeth II. Yeah. I think there are some really good examples in that relationship. And then also things that you look at that and you think, that's really weird. I'm not sure I would like to have my marriage or someone I cared about to have a marriage exactly like that. And I think that's where I land on most of the examples of marriage that I can think of. There's no one marriage I could point to and go, that they've just got everything together. And there are some great examples of marriage that I have in my life, but no one quite gets it right. And when you're looking at the Bible and trying to find examples, not just of teaching on marriage, but of married couples, it's not a whole heap of great examples in there. A lot of the examples you get given are kind of more cautionary tales, or even if there are positive things to get from that relationship, there are lots of things that you want to probably avoid as well. We've said it lots of times before, but King David in the Bible often used as an example for countless things. A man after God's own heart, but pretty poor at marriage, if you think of it in that way. There are lots of other examples, and we're not going to go into all of those today. The couple that Alice gave me, Alice created this sermon series for over the summer, to focus on thinking of a purpose-driven marriage, was Priscilla and Aquila. Has anyone heard of those guys before? Yeah. So Priscilla and Aquila they're a couple that we hear about in the New Testament, first of all in Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, this description of the early church as it grows both in number and spreads out across the world. But we don't know a whole heap about them. So I was thrilled to find that I was going to have to hang the whole talk on really just a couple of verses. But I've done some digging, and we've got something at least. But let me just recap where we've been so far. So this is the penultimate, the 5 out of 6, the fifth talk in a series called Relatable, which we've been covering over the summer holidays. And the idea was to look at ways that God calls us to relate to others, relationship types that God calls us into. And first we looked at communion with God, this idea that's how it all started, that our relationship with God himself is the foundation. We're made in his image, and all our other relationships flow out of that. And then we heard about spiritual mentoring. We looked at the characters of Elijah and Elisha and something of the dynamic between them, and how that mentoring relationship is key in a Christian setup, in a Christian church family, in any kind of relationship. You should be mentored, you should be mentoring and being mentored by those around you. An intentional and relational discipleship that kind of multiplies and leaves a legacy behind it. Then we thought about covenant friendship. We used the example of Jonathan and David, and Alice spoke to us about that, and saw that that's a different kind of friendship, this covenantal friendship that's deep and loyal and has a sacrificial bond. And it's a glimpse of what it means to walk faithfully alongside each other in love. And then last week, David spoke to us about faithful parenting. And we looked at a few examples, including Abraham and Isaac. We wrestled with what it means to be faithful parents, and how actually that doesn't mean that we get it right all the time, but that we trust God with our children, and we parent not in our own strength, but in partnership with the Spirit. And in all of these things, the parenting one and the mentoring one and they're all things that we can all access and all get on board with, whether we are a parent or not. We have a responsibility to be spiritual parents to one another as well as to actual minors, children, right? We need to be caring for one another in that dynamic. That's part of being a family. And in the same way, though you might not directly mentor somebody, and that was a particular relationship we were thinking about, we're all called to be part of that mentoring dynamic within the community of faith. And the interesting thing then about marriage is it's a hard one, because how do you do a preach about marriage to people who aren't married or perhaps aren't even in a relationship? Is it just then irrelevant? Are all the application points something that you don't need to worry about? And I suppose you could look at it that way, but marriage is the foundation on which the family is built. It's an example that God gives us in the Bible of where children are best brought up and nurtured, and it's also an example that's supposed to point us to how Jesus and his church interact. So there should be something, whether we're involved in a particular marriage of our own or not, for everyone to pick up through this. Now, the marriage we're talking about is not in the kind of sort of shallow sense that our culture often talks about it. It's not centered on romance or a personal fulfillment or a big day that you want to have to mark a moment. Instead, looking at Priscilla and Aquila, we will see a couple whose life is marked by mission, hospitality, and discipleship. Their marriage is like a spiritual friendship, and we'll unpack a little bit more what that might mean, with a purpose, and it's rooted in God. They grow in Christ together, but remain open to others. Now, yesterday, a number of us were in Harrogate for Abby and Ollie's wedding. You might remember Abby and Ollie, depending on how long you've been here, who came as part of the Graft a year and a half ago, and there were students at Newcastle. Abby is from Harrogate, and they were getting married there, and they've moved back down there since graduating. It was really nice to be in a marriage service that was unapologetically focused on God. Ollie and Abby were really clear that they wanted their wedding to reflect that single focus that they both have individually in their lives, because they wanted not just the wedding, but the marriage as it goes on and on also to reflect that single purpose. And we could stop the talk now, because essentially the point is purpose-driven marriage is driven by the purpose of God. So if you're all pulling in the same direction towards God, that's the essence of the purpose in your purpose-driven marriage. And if you're not married, you can help those who are married to be pulling in that same direction through your friendship with them, through pointing them to the right way to do things. Yesterday, we thought about various different bits, and I'm really confused because I preached at the wedding and took it yesterday, and then I had to speak on marriage today, and the two sermons are understandably similar, but quite different. And so I'm hoping that I don't, by picking things up from one, just get completely lost in the middle. But we were thinking from the passages that Ollie and Abby had spoken about how the promises made. We thought about a passage from Colossians and one from Ephesians that were about clothing ourselves with virtues and attributes, and that those are things for Christian life, but essential, therefore, also for married life. About clothing ourselves in compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience, and then putting on the armor of God together to face the battles that the world will bring us together. But in both of those things, the thing that actually made them work was God, trusting in God, doing it for the purpose of God. Should we read some of the Bible together? Acts chapter 18. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Okay, and we skip on to verse 18. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchreae, and because of a vow he had taken there. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila, and he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined, but as he left, he promised, "I will come back if it's in God's will." Then he set sail from Ephesus, and when he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he only knew the baptism of John, which means baptism in water, but not of the Holy Spirit. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. When he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, proving from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, if you can, skip in your Bibles to Romans chapter 16. That's on page 1106, 05. And we're just going to read a few verses from that. This is at the end of Paul, who we've just heard about, at the end of his letter to the church in Rome, where he gives greetings. And he says in verse 3 of chapter 16, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Greet also the church that meets in their house." This, collectively, is the word of the Lord. There's a number of things about Priscilla and Aquila that are curious. And I'll touch on one to begin with, but I'm not going to go into great depth. We can do it another time. But Priscilla is mentioned first here in the letter to the Romans. You'll notice that in Acts, it says that Paul met a Jew named Aquila, and then later introduces his wife, Priscilla. But when Paul addresses the couple, he puts the lady first. "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus." And this is curious and worth noting because it's unusual. The usual thing was to put the man first because that was the cultural norm, and indeed today it still tends to be the cultural norm. And it's been used, that cultural norm, to perpetuate an idea that the man is the significant or most important member of a relationship, particularly of a marriage. And that's not what we see in the Bible, and that's not what we see, small though it might seem, in this bit of an example of Priscilla and Aquila. Not only that, but just beforehand, Paul thanks Phoebe at the beginning of chapter 16, our sister Phoebe, a servant or a deaconess of the church in Cenchreae. He sent the letter to the Romans with Phoebe. And Phoebe, therefore, would have had to explain what Paul meant in the letter to the Romans as it was read to the church in Rome. If you've ever read the letter to the Romans, you'll know that it's relatively complex, and pages and pages and pages of theology have been written arguing about what it means or doesn't mean. So to hand to Phoebe the job of interpreting and explaining and answering questions about this fantastically important and complex theological treatise showed that there was no real partiality between male or female in Paul's approach to ministry or in his approach to who was allowed to teach or not allowed to teach. And similarly, again, then, in the next verse, how he describes Priscilla and Aquila, these church leaders. I mean, they're lay church leaders. They're not named as apostles or, as we would think of it now, being ordained or being, in charge of a church. But we can't draw all our examples of what church should look like from the New Testament. It's a very different setup. And any house church movement, if it's successful, has to grow at some point into having more structures and procedures because it grows in size. And otherwise it becomes unwieldy. And we see some of that unfold in the New Testament. But we see that Priscilla and Aquila have a complete equality in their marriage and their position as house church leaders. But they don't do it as I do it. So I, believe it or not, this is not my job, even though, as far as HMRC are concerned, this is my job. I'm paid by the Church of England so that I don't have to work. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't work, don't worry, but I'm paid so that I can give all my time to what I do here at church and don't need to spend my time earning money in order to support myself and my family. That's the theory of the model. That's not how it always ends up working in every example, but that's the theory of the model. Priscilla and Aquila are tent makers, and they support themselves in order to be able to lead the house church. They don't have a building like we have here. They have their home. And so they invite the local people, the local believers, into their home to be members of this church. There are a few things that I'd love to say about marriage in general. And I think Priscilla and Aquila do example this. But because of the scant information about them, it's hard to extrapolate these points specifically from Priscilla and Aquila. But one of the things that's different about marriage to a long-term relationship or friendship is that it's a covenant. So it's a covenantal relationship rather than a contract or something you can dip in and out of. And ultimately, that makes it different not just from relationships, but from non-Christian marriages or marriages that don't relate in some way to God. Because those are fundamentally just contracts. You sign a contract and you agree that you're going to do this, that, and the other, so long as they do this, that, and the other. And that means that if someone breaks the contract, everybody's free to just crack on and do whatever they see fit. But a covenant is very different. Those of you who were at the wedding yesterday will know that, and most of you will know this anyway, but there's a key line in the marriage service liturgy. The couples promise the promises to one another until death us do part. And that's quite a final get-out clause, right? And now that doesn't mean that we're trying to apply some sort of terrible imprisoning thing to someone in an abusive relationship or where there's terrible relational breakdown, but that the purpose of this marriage is forever. It's not something that you just stick with when it works for you, but as soon as it starts to not work, then we start thinking about how we might break it off or do it differently. In Genesis, right at the very beginning, in chapter 2, we're told about the way that a woman will and a man will leave their previous families and cleave to one another and become one flesh together. And again, I say in the marriage service, as the person officiating it, what God has joined together, let no one put asunder. Because marriage as a Christian relationship, as a covenant, is not just a contract between two people, but a covenant made in the sight and empowered and enforced by God, the third member of any Christian marriage. It's also a picture of divine love. So most of the ways that Christians are told to relate to their marital partners are related back to the way Jesus or God relates to us. A lot has been made about whether a wife should promise to obey or not her husband in the marriage liturgy. And in many ways, it's kind of irrelevant. Because in the passage that talks about that, the higher call is then given to the husband anyway. It doesn't sound as subservient and horrible as having to obey somebody. But the man is called to love his wife as Christ loves the church. That bigger picture of marriage. And who knows what Christ did for the church? He died. But he didn't just die quietly, he died the most horrific death. So you tell me, which is worse? Dying on the cross for your wife or obeying your husband? Right? They're both different challenges that express something of what God calls us to in a marriage relationship. We're also called in other places really to have a mutual submission to one another. It's not that one party sits above the other. Priscilla and Aquila, they endure some really big things in their marriage. They're uprooted from Rome. They're sent away. We read that in the Acts passage there. That, let me find it. Claudius, I'd forgotten who it was, had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. And Priscilla and Aquila leave, but they stay together. They endure the expulsion from Rome and the hardship that came with that to being settled where they were now in Corinth. And then the risk that we read about in Romans 16 of becoming Christians, not only Christians, but leaders of a church. It's not a very, it seems like a kind of a well-to-do thing now, or something with respect, although people do give you a mix of different views when you wear a dog collar out in public these days. But actually, back then, being a church leader is not the sort of high position of society that it is today. It takes on risk. But their marriage is able to sustain that risk because they stay faithful not just to one another through their covenant, but also to the mutual purpose that they are walking towards, to God. Marriage is also, as a purpose-driven thing, something which brings us spiritual growth within the marriage relationship, but also hopefully to those who experience it on the outside. I don't know about anyone else who's married, but I find that my marriage exposes my selfishness profoundly. Because if I'm called to be so sacrificial that I would die for my wife, then it really puts into perspective when I'm not willing to do that little thing for her. Whether that's, she's asking me to pump up the tires on her bike again, and it's really not that hard. Could she not just do it herself? Or whether that's something domestic, like I've been told that I've done something wrong, and I think, well, there's no point doing that again, because I'll just get it wrong a second time. She can do it herself. And you step back and you realize how selfish you really are, because you're not even willing in those little things to give to your other half. It's a very exposing relationship to be in. But what's different about a Christian marriage, a covenantal marriage, if you will, to just a relationship, is that And maybe Abby and I feel this more profoundly than others, but our marriage is public. The purpose of it is not for Abby and I. It's not even for our children, but it's for the good of the whole of our community. And as a vicar, I invite people into my home in a way that isn't always true for everybody. And people get to see how badly I do things, as well as how well I do things. They get to see the reality of a family mealtime or a bedtime, where I don't just ask my children to do something and then they hop up and do it immediately. Sometimes there's even some shouting. And Abby and I argue. But that's the way marriage should be. Marriage isn't primarily for the people who are married, but for the rest of the world. And in a Christian context, it's for God and for the church. David was saying just before the service that one of the things he loves about marriage is that you get more than the constituent parts are worth. Marriage has a way of enhancing each individual's gift and bringing more when they come together. So rather than just getting twice as much as you would with one person, you get 3 or 4 or 5 times as much. Another thing that marriage does is it forges your character. If our goal is to be like Christ, then a marriage shows you both where you're not like that and gives you a partner in hoping to be more like that. It also helps us to learn forgiveness and grace for one another. And if we see Priscilla and Aquila modeling a mature partnership with each other as church leaders, then we see also that they will grow together by learning and teaching. We look at how they interact with Apollos. Apollos is not a new kid on the block when it comes to knowledge. He's got great knowledge. He's well respected. People listen to him. He's already teaching well. But listen to what Priscilla and Aquila do. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately, which suggested that he did have an adequate understanding, but more adequately suggests there was something in the way that Priscilla and Aquila worked together to explain what it is that God does for them and how he makes them more holy, that enhanced even Apollos, the sparky, blue-eyed new kid, to preach even better. And Apollos goes on to have a great following and a great ministry. And we think largely that might be in part to his time spent with Priscilla and Aquila. Another thing that marriage is a mission. And fundamentally, I think that's the main thing that marriage should be. It shouldn't be mainly about the people in the marriage, and it shouldn't be without God. It should be, yes, for the world, but the mission is to share Jesus more effectively by being married than otherwise. Now, it doesn't mean that you are automatically more effective in a marriage at sharing Jesus. That's not the case. And we read elsewhere in the New Testament, Paul tells us that it's better to remain single in order to give yourself fully to the gospel. But if being married doesn't help you to share the gospel better, then what's the point? Why is it better? Why are you doing it? I want to think a little bit about a guy called Aelred of Revo. He's not actually of Revo, he's of Hexham originally. And this is a man who was knocking around in the 12th century, so a long, long time ago. And he writes various good works, one of which is called Spiritual Friendship. And he describes something of our relationship with God as a spiritual friendship. I'm going to read a little bit from a commentary on his work. The fact that friendship rests on shared interests was well discussed by the saint Aelred of Revo. His most famous work is probably his Spiritual Friendship, a treatise written at the end of his life. In it, he says, friendship is agreement in things human and divine, with goodwill and charity. Aylerud develops this theme by classifying three kinds of friendship: the carnal, the worldly, and the spiritual. The carnal is created by conspiracy in vice, the worldly is enkindled by a hope of gain, and the spiritual is cemented among the righteous by a likeness of lifestyles and interests. At each level, friendship is nurtured by common love. As the object of the love increases in worth, so the quality of the friendship is raised. The highest kind of friendship is a selfless communion of hearts. He says, now the spiritual, which we call true friendship, is desired for its own natural worth and for the affections of the human heart, so that its fruit and reward is nothing but itself. This spiritual friendship, which you could say was a bit of a picture of marriage, is a friendship with purpose. It's helping one another further towards your future glory self. It's helping to make each other more like Jesus. Priscilla and Aquila host this church, and their home is open for ministry. We read that again in another of Paul's letters in 1 Corinthians. And together they disciple Apollos. Priscilla and Aquila are a kingdom partnership. And they combine work and hospitality and teaching and risk-taking. And their marriage is far bigger than they themselves are. Priscilla and Aquila's story shows us that marriage isn't ultimately about a compatibility or a comfortable thing that makes you feel better about yourself, but it's a covenant. It has Christ-likeness and mission at its heart. And I was racking my brains to try and think of good examples, but I think Abby and I sometimes don't do this that well. Sometimes, particularly in the stage of life that we're in at the moment, we have 3 small kids. It's busy. Abby works. She has her own career. We don't do a shared ministry thing together all the time, but we do pull in the same direction when it comes to pointing each other towards Jesus. And that's what we do most regularly. And sometimes it sometimes it feels like you're being picked up on the things that you're not very good at. And other times it feels like you're being encouraged in things that you're great at that are being recognized. But if we weren't constantly pointing each other towards Jesus, then I don't know what the purpose of our marriage would be. Be something significantly more selfish. I wonder then, if you're married, whether you can ask yourself the question, is your marriage primarily a contract or a covenant? Is it something where you expect of the other, and if they don't come through, you help them see how they've not come through, and you kind of hold them to account for it and threaten something over them? Or is it something mutually working together in a covenant sense? Can we help everybody, whether married or not, as the church being married to Christ, to live in a purpose-driven marriage? The purpose being God's glory and the furthering of the kingdom.